Hello everyone, welcome to the Share Your Green Design podcast. Before we begin today's episode, just a reminder that you can follow and subscribe to us over on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also find the full video version of each episode over on YouTube. We're also on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and WeChat at Share Your Green Design. That's all one word, Share Your Green Design. And remember, the podcast is only one small part of what is an ever-growing platform. So head on over to shareyourgreendesign.com to keep up to date with the latest in sustainable architecture, engineering, and construction. We've got projects, news, research, events, competitions, student work, jobs, everything you need. We'd love to have you as a visitor, but also as a contributor, so you're always welcome to send us your own projects, ideas, events, job openings, and much more. You'll find all the details on shareyourgreendesign.com. Once again, that's shareyourgreendesign.com. Thank you again for your support, and with that, we hope you enjoyed today's episode. Stacy, thanks a million for doing this, and morning over there in Seattle, evening over here in Ireland. But to start us off, could you give a brief introduction into yourself and who you are, your background, and what it is you're doing these days?
Sure. Yeah. So currently I'm the executive director of Building Transparency, which I know we'll get into over the course of the interview. I started my career at the architecture side, actually, and always focused on green design and architecture based on the fact that I grew up in a place that was pretty rural in Clackamas, Oregon. I called it the edge of suburbia. And I watched my grandpa kind of sell our land around our house, and it was clear cut and turned into a housing development when I was 8. And so I told my mom that I wanted to find a way to build buildings that weren't going to destroy nature, because I just seen what we could do if we just don't think about it. We can just negate all of that wonderful kind of like my playground that I had when I was a kid of trees and streams and animals. And humans can make choices that can be good or bad, what we do when we try to build things. So started on the architecture side, thinking that I could approach that by designing really, really good, restorative, responsible, environmentally friendly buildings. Went to architecture school, worked for an architecture firm for my first 10 years, and realized that on the architecture side, for me, I was doing good work kind of one building at a time, but saw a perspective from the contractor side, working with Skanska on some projects that if I could go kind of help invest and implement strategies across a portfolio of buildings through the construction lens, maybe that would be a good thing to do. So I joined Skanska and became a sustainability director there. And it was really there that I was able to have the time and focus to really dig into environmental impacts of buildings, both how we design and build them, and get to the point where carbon emissions and embodied carbon specifically became a focus based on the amount of impacts that there is there to address, but also that, clients that we were working for and Skanska as a company was setting zero carbon targets. And we really needed to understand those embodied carbon emissions to really start to reduce our impacts and get to zero. And that led to the development of a tool called the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator that was conceived of during my time at Skanska. And seed funded by Skanska and Microsoft, but then open sourced through an incubation at a university group called the Carbon Leadership Forum that led to the nonprofit being established, and Skanska donating my time to run that nonprofit as the executive director and continue to scale this free tool that's trying to address embodied carbon emissions. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the whole story, and
sure,
as fast as I could do it.
That's very actually impressive to pack in so much stuff into 30 seconds and 45. And the nonprofit then is Building Transparency, right?
Correct.
So could you? I'd love to talk a little bit actually about that process of going from being an architect involved in constructing and designing, constructing buildings to eventually arriving at software. But before we do that, could you also give an introduction into Building Transparency and what it is they do now?
Sure. Yeah. So Building Transparency was established in January of 2020, so not too long ago, and its sole purpose at the beginning was really to take over the continued management of the EC3 tool once it was launched publicly. So the tool needed a home where it could stay free and open access and have a place for funding to come in that could really sponsor that mission of a free open access tool and database. the mission of the nonprofit's expanded. It's to provide free open access data and tools with an S, because there's just so much to address here when it comes to reducing embodied carbon emissions of the construction sector. That core focus of EC3 management and scaling still exists, but there's all these other projects and things that we need to do kind of around the tool to support data standardization and digitization of these disclosures and all the things. So we actually have a lot of work that we're doing kind of attached to EC3 that's not directly the tool currently. We're funded by kind of cross-sector pilot partners and sponsors. So we have administrative funding through Breakthrough Energy, which is a group that funds largely material innovations like low carbon materials, but also is giving grants to companies and organizations that are working to help bolster the demand for those low carbon materials. We have owners like Microsoft and Amazon and Salesforce and Google that are funding us to help make the tool free for everyone else, but also to help pilot the tool at their organizations as a way to account for their Scope 3 embodied carbon emissions of all of their buildings. We have architects, engineers, contractors, and material industry organizations and manufacturers all funding us and piloting the tool with us to help improve it, because everything that we do to improve the tool for them then gets published for the free version that everyone else gets to interact with.
The kind of an interesting point that kind of underlines all of that is that you're somebody that started off from an architectural background, working in firm and practice, and transitioned through contracting and then through to developing software and to kind of hosting software. And when we think about climate change and we think about the architect's role in combating climate change, it's something that I talk about a lot, actually, is how we do need to break outside of just building design. Architects have a whole lot of skills that we learn through education, critical thinking, lateral thinking, cross-disciplinary thinking, that it doesn't always need to be focused on building design. And actually, you are an incredible example of somebody who really has taken that to the next level and fighting climate change, not only through building design, but also through creating the tools, creating the conditions for other people to fight, and other architects to fight climate change. I'm curious about, was it difficult or daunting to go on that journey from building design to software design? Do you see any parallels, or is it like a totally different world? And do you think there was anything in your architectural background that has kind of equipped you to be able to deal with and to think about software and explore and understand software in the same way that we're kind of taught to explore and understand a building?
No, I think I thought about that a lot, and it was actually something I had to work through when I made the choice to transition from architecture and design to construction and kind of implementation of buildings. And what I came to realize is, I think what really excited me about architecture when I started, it was fun to draw and to see buildings come into fruition that you put down on paper that came out of your brain. But that directly applies to the same things when you're thinking about when you're building a building and you're thinking about the pieces and materials and you're seeing them come to fruition, or even with software, where you're kind of imagining what the software could look like. You are designing it. There is a design aspect to software because you want it to look and function well, so that others, like the users, which would be the building occupants in a building's case, are going to be able to interact with that and use it the way that you'd hope they would. So I think there's actually a lot of the same process that goes into both construction. When I've worked with superintendents and the folks that are kind of imagineering and figuring out how to take the drawings and picturing it in their brains as a built object, but also on the software side. The other part that I think is really interesting is there's a psychology part of architecture in terms of an architect's role in bringing diverse stakeholders together, listening to them, and then designing something that's meeting all of their needs. And I think with software specifically, it's exactly the same thing. I've learned that what I was for EC3 was the product owner, which is an actual term, where you're the person that's really the owner of what that tool is going to look like, and you're listening to all sorts of different people that are going to want it for and to use it for different reasons, and you're creating what that's going to look like in a visual that really engages people to use it and makes it function. So I think software design, I think, is very much similar to building design. I think a lot of the traits that we learned in architecture school are applicable. I think it helped me, quite honestly.
Yeah, they all kind of a lot of the terminology you hear in software, you can also kind of apply it to building scan. You user experience, UX,
Yep.
kind of underlying operating systems. All of these
Yep.
things. You actually the product is different, but the process and the underlying thinking is kind of similar.
Yep.
And before we came on here, we were just talking about Tally, which is one of the software tools, which is under Building Transparency's umbrella now, which was originally designed by Kieran Timberlake, an architecture
Yep.
firm, and which kind of goes to the same point about how there is, and software is just one of those realms. There's all these different realms that architects can engage in to fight climate. Building design obviously is incredibly important, but it's not. We don't have to be limited to that. I'm actually curious. What kind of team does Building Transparency have in terms of like professionals? Do you engage a lot with architects? Do they work in house, or what does the kind of team look like at Building Transparency?
Yes, we've got our core team. We've actually, it started with me kind of launching it and having my time donated to make it really kind of an agile startup nonprofit. But we've added 3 people full time in the past 18 months. So we have two that come from life cycle assessment backgrounds, kind of the data methodology work that we need to do. So that gets into like the stuff behind the UI, how we're looking at the data and crunching it and modeling and doing uncertainty analyses and all sorts of things. One of those 2 was actually a sustainability consultant too. So he had deep knowledge of Tally and brought some of that kind of software experience. Then we actually have someone that's come on that was on the program operator side, so kind of the EPD world and how you set up standards for EPDs. So our core team is very much kind of on the methodology side of all of this data that we're dealing with. But I think our expanded team is really all of our pilot partners. So the model that we have with our funding and our partnerships is that, Perkins and Will and ZGF on the architecture side right now, our pilot partners. Perkins and Will has done it for 2 years in a row, where they're funding us to, again, support the mission of the tool and its free and open access nature, but also meeting with us biweekly. So every pilot partner that we have gets a biweekly meeting with our team where we're showing them what the tool currently looks like in the pilot version, where we're testing all of these things. They're giving us responsive feedback on the new features we're thinking about. They're saying, gosh, we were using the tool last week and we wish it would have done this. We take all of that back from all of these partners and then can make the tool better and improve. So I actually think our team is actually really big because it's really all of those people that we're engaging with deeply through these pilot partnerships. And again, that's cross-sector. So we're getting input from architects like Perkins and Will, ZGF, engineers like MKA and Walter P. Moore on the structural side, contractors like Turner and Skanska and Mercury Engineering out of your neck of the woods. And they really are a team that's really improving the tool iteratively with us.
Can we talk a little bit about embodied carbon, because that is a topic which underlines a lot of what Building Transparency is trying to do and draw attention to. And a lot, when I look at not climate discourse, but more so climate legislation, it's incredible to me how much embodied carbon, particularly in construction, is ignored. Because a lot of focus goes into renewable energy, 100% renewable energy, and energy sourcing, wind, solar, etc., and operational emissions. We seem to be, or certainly in Europe, I feel we are behind on an understanding also of embodied carbon, because there's some statistics that say that embodied carbon is responsible for half of a building's emissions throughout its entire life, that half the emissions have been generated before the building is occupied, and a lot of our focus is on the occupation and the performance in that. Is that also how you see it, or do you think maybe it's a bit unfair to say that we don't focus as much on embodied carbon? But also as well, could you kind of just spell out your own thoughts on how important it is to measure embodied carbon in buildings, and how important it is for architects to do it as well?
Sure. Yeah, I think just the statistic you said is right. I think I've now been looking and thinking about this and working on it for, I would say, 6 years, right? So 6 years ago was when really people were starting to say, okay, I can get to some average emissions factors for some of these materials, and I can start to do that comparative, like what is embodied versus operational. So just to ground everyone, if you aren't an embodied carbon nerd like me yet, embodied carbon's all of the emissions associated with extracting, manufacturing, installing, transporting building materials. And that could be the fuel spend of the equipment or the actual process of making something like cement and the CO2 that comes out. And all of that is stuff that once you've done it, once it's emitted, and that building is operational, it's in the atmosphere and you can't take it back. So it's unique from operational carbon and energy, where we try to design it well, but we know that there's going to be improvements and retrofits and decarbonization of the grid and things that are happening that are going to continue to lower the curve and reduce those emissions. Once you've spent the emissions on the embodied carbon side, there's no going back and being like, oops, I could have done that better, and actually reducing it because they're already spent. So they're really important to be, they have to be focused on during design and procurement. You can't kind of leave it to later to think that more improvements are going to happen. So architects play a key role in that because they're the ones that are specifying the materials and actually deciding what a building's made of. It's a very important role. On the policy side, I would say that because we now understand that at least 50% of the emissions in a building's footprint over its lifetime to 2050 are in the embodied carbon bucket, there has been kind of an awakening that I've watched happen as we've been developing EC3 and really getting into the accounting. There's policies now at different country levels in Europe. There's an EU taxonomy that's talking about requiring life cycle assessments for new buildings for any EU-based company. There's reports coming out from the World Green Building Council and the World Business for Sustainable Development that are all putting out methodologies for how to account for this. So if you think about where we were with operational energy, maybe 20, 30 years ago, about figuring out how to account for it and understanding it's a big problem, I think we're right there with embodied carbon. The problem is that we don't have another 30 years to actually figure it out and decarbonize, because that gets us past 2050, which is even too far down the road now to be at zero based on climate science. So there's an urgency about it. But I do see it happening, and I see it coming to the table in terms of policy. Here in the States, there's policy at the state level called Buy Clean that's been implemented in 2 states now that requires EPDs, environmental product declarations, kind of the accounting, and it's going to set limits. There's federal policy being proposed that does the same thing. There's actually a really good resource on the Carbon Leadership Forum's website. If you just Google Carbon Leadership Forum policy, that outlines all of the US policies, and it's pretty impressive. I think we're right at the point now where we're going to see if what actually gets implemented, because there's a lot of things being proposed. I think COP26 is going to be an interesting time too, because I've heard a lot more about buildings and decarbonization and embodied carbon than I ever have before in terms of the conversations leading up to COP.
That's right. There's a whole day at COP going to be devoted, Built Environment Day. It's called. I think it's the last day of COP. It's like the 12th.
Yeah, it's
of November.
the day before. Yep. It's the 11th, I think. But yeah, it's right there at the end, and there's just the focus is not just operational when it comes to all those discussions. It's kind of whole life carbon and looking at both of those buckets. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that.
Is there much conversation in America about this idea of material passports? Because it's a conversation we hear a lot over here in Europe. And again, people who don't know material passport, it's kind of similar to what you alluded to about kind of material stamps. It's information about where a material has come from, emissions on how it was extracted. It's almost like a product label for a building which focuses on environmentalism. And there's increasingly an onus in some countries in Europe to declare more environmental information about construction materials. Do you see similar kind of moves in the US to, I guess, put an onus on, because obviously it's important for architects to pay attention to these things too, but also on manufacturers to be transparent about where their products have come from and emissions in products?
Yeah, so the mechanism that the US is currently relying on, which is also true to Europe to some degree, are environmental product declarations for that assessment. So I think the material passport takes it a little bit farther than what an EPD does. But at the baseline, an EPD is a third-party verified declaration the supplier invests in that does an assessment of their product for environmental impacts, including carbon or global warming potential, but other things like acidification and eutrophication. And then publishes it as a document that can be used. It gives you a carbon intensity per unit. So just like we have a carbohydrate per serving size for a food item, it gives you that kilogram of CO2 per unit for the material. That's really the information that we've digitized and we use in EC3. So these EPDs are kind of the baseline standard. In my mind, I think if we can have a baseline standard of that ISO compliant, EN compliant EPD, as a global mechanism for this kind of carbon intensity per unit data to start to develop at the product level, these passports and other things that are adding in maybe more disclosures and more requirements could be built on top of them.
Mm-hmm.
But that EPD is really what's being used as the proxy right now, and gives you that product specific emissions factor, which is really the first thing that we need to be tackling in terms of reductions.
Mm-hmm. Bringing this to software, then, do you and you talked about how we don't have another 30 years to go through the same process of realization with embodied carbon that we had with operational carbon. Do you think we're at a stage now with software like the software that Building Transparency hosts that architects can now effectively measure embodied carbon in a design proposal, that the barriers that used to be there about questions over where products have come from or their own emissions that used to be kind of an excuse to not pay attention to embodied carbon. Do you think that we're at a point now where it's as if like architects don't really have an excuse now? They can go to a platform like Building Transparency, they can acquire free software to do all of this. Is it do you think we're at a point now where that's 100% feasible?
I wouldn't say 100% because I think it's going to be constant improvement.
Yeah.
I would say that yes, it's possible now. So what EC3 is allowing you to do, there are other tools too that are available that are either free or paid for, that do whole building lifecycle assessment. You mentioned Tally. There's also OneClick, and there's also Athena that are at various versions of free or paid for, and that do these life cycle assessments for the kind of the whole life carbon of a building. EC3 is really a free platform where an architect can go in and say, okay, I am trying to figure out if I should source my steel from the US or Europe or wherever. I can look at the carbon intensity from those disclosed EPDs and make a choice in my spec if I'm going to say US made steel as an example, or I'm looking at carpet tiles and I have Interface and Shaw and Mohawk and whoever else, Milliken, and I can go in and I can say, okay, I know I use these 4 products and I can understand the carbon intensity, and why wouldn't I spec the lowest one in my specifications? Why wouldn't I use that one if I know I have the data in front of me? So yes, that is possible now. It's not complete in terms of all materials being covered. I think that there's gaps when it comes to for concrete, ready mix concrete. You need to have that mix specific EPD from the plant that you're procuring the concrete from. We've got over 50,000 concrete EPDs in the US market, but it's only 5% of the concrete plants. So we are getting there, and we have these pockets, but there's got to be filled in. There are categories like MEP systems that still need disclosures. So depending on the category, there's a different ask right now. For some, the data's there, go use it. For others, if you're in, Texas or even Ireland, you might need to go ask your concrete supplier for that mix specific EPD. Or there might be a category where we have to actually educate our mechanical supplier of our heating and cooling equipment and say, hey, this is what an EPD is. Will you please disclose? We are going to start asking for this or requiring it. So again, I think it's a constantly improving process. I think for major materials, we have the data to start. And I think for many materials, we can actually show reductions right now. In Washington, we have concrete EPDs for all of our suppliers that are the major ones in the Seattle market. And over the past 2 years, using EC3 across just a few projects, their average emissions have dropped by 20% holistically for all of their mixes. So where we are having the data and using it, we're seeing reductions develop. So there's no reason not to start. It's okay that you don't have everything, and it's okay that it's not perfect, but we have enough. And again, the timeline is so condensed. If we don't start with what we have, we're never going to improve it, but also we're not going to make reductions in the time that we have left. So.
In terms of using the software then, and I know there's several different softwares that we're kind of talking about as one group, but as somebody who has an architectural background and who's been involved in building design, do you have any kind of tips for architects on using these softwares and actually integrating them with design processes? Because I feel that the way that architectural processes have kind of evolved over the past 10 or 20 years with BIM, 3D modeling being placed almost at the very, very beginning of the design process now, and architects are increasingly making decisions about material and form very early in the process, and that by generating 3D models, they have more access. It should be easier now than ever before to embed these kind of softwares and tests and analysis from early on. I wonder, do you often think about how someone like yourself would use these softwares, or any kind of tips for how should they be should this be like a regular process that architects use to help designs grow, or is it more for, say, key stages in a project to run these tests? Are there particular times where it's more crucial, say when you're literally specifying a product? Do you often have any thoughts about when in the process it's most valuable or appropriate to use this software?
Yeah, so I think I'll break it into two types of software. So whole building lifecycle assessment, where you're using average emissions factors and looking at all the stages, is really good to use early. So when you're trying to make a decision between a timber or a steel and concrete building, or you're looking at an envelope system with triple glazing versus double, if you can attach those average factors and just have that as part of your decision making process, where you're looking at maybe cost and aesthetics, but also, okay, here's the carbon difference between this design and that design directionally on average. That allows comparisons between materials. And that's really what Tally, One Click, and Athena to some degree do now. What comes next is, your building is now optimized from a material perspective. Hopefully you use that carbon data to say, I've optimized the systems, and I'm going to do a hybrid building with timber here and concrete there, and I know that's what I'm doing. Then stage 2 is to go in and specify the lowest carbon options per each of those materials. And that's where EC3 comes in, where you can say, okay, I've got my quantities, I have these materials, I can go multiply my quantities times that product and get my actual carbon content and make a low carbon procurement and spec decision. So optimize the systems first using whole building LCA, specify the lowest carbon options based on EPDs and what EC3 gives you, and then realize the actual carbon emissions of your building by attaching those EPDs to your quantities during construction. I mean, that's really the whole process. What we're working on right now with the next version of Tally, now that we've got that from Kieran Timberlake, and really what they were hoping we would do was figure out a way to really actually, right now you do your model in Revit, you hit a button, you get a report that spits out into a PDF for the results of your whole building lifecycle assessment. Have a Revit plugin in beta where you can export your quantities, attach all the carbon emissions factors, and then bring them back into your model, where you can actually start clicking on to different components of your design in the Revit platform and see the carbon emissions and the relative of that material versus the whole project, and kind of bring it more into the design process, where it's not an export or a click a button and submit type workflow for whole building LCA. So I think that's my inclination with my architecture brain, thinking of how we can, if it's something that just becomes part of what you're doing as you're designing and modeling in the software you're using, and it's just data that's attached to it, the more it's embedded in that versus an export. I think the closer we'll get to having it be part of the process as you're designing. So that there's work being done there, but I think right now there are those buckets of things. It's directionally average, system versus system, then it's product versus product, and then it's what did I actually procure when I built it. I don't know if that helps, but
oh no, definitely. I'm kind of like taking notes for myself because for my own practice. To go from how to use the software then to how to learn how to use the software, because one of the, and I think a lot of people will feel this, even not architects, but any kind of sector, one of the most challenging things is continued professional development, trying to continue to acquire skills and tools as the world of work changes around us, trying to keep pace with technology like that. It's almost like running a marathon against a particular quick runner. You're just constantly trying to keep up, and eventually you have to give up somewhere. But how, and it, in the context of climate and climate software, it is important for architects to keep on top of the latest tools which are available to them, to ultimately ease and facilitate design, not to make it more complex. Do you have any tips or kind of thoughts on how architects could, and when I say architects, engineers as well, and people involved in the design process, how they can better their skills? So is it a case of practice makes perfect? Is it something that you should just immediately just try and integrate into your workflows in real life projects? Should it be more about firms encouraging employees to take time or allow time to grow understandings in-house before rolling them out to real life projects? And even in terms of resources, is it the classic kind of there's a YouTube tutorial for everything, so go try and experiment and learn, or would you recommend another structure for for growing your skill set or your knowledge of how to use climate software?
I'm a big fan of pilots just in general. And I think thinking of all of this through the lens of piloting things. So, when I was trying to figure this out at Skanska, I went and I downloaded all the available softwares that were doing something to do with embodied carbon. I tried to use them. I figured out how expensive they were going to be if they were something behind a license fee. And what led to EC3 was me not finding one that I could use or understand that was doing this one specific thing that I really, really needed to do, and realizing that was a gap that was bigger than just for me. So that was actually kind of my pilot of why I thought EC3 was necessary, through the spec and procurement lens and trying to make it as easy as possible. But I think doing that, there's multiple solutions for a lot of these different things in the climate space from a tools perspective, and you kind of just have to invest a little bit of time to figure out, this one works for me, this one doesn't. I like this one better. What are the barriers for me to use this one or that? And that really comes from, I think, self-motivation and being someone that cares about this and wants to be the person at the firm, or the company that understands this and can bring this to the table. We also need the top down, though. I think when I was in architecture, I worked for a firm that would kind of allow us to experiment and had time for research, and would give us space to do some of that. I think that a lot of the times in architecture, you feel like you've got to get this job done and you're billable. And if you don't have someone telling you that there's an assurance that you have this little bit of space to play in these things that could provide added value, that it could be a challenge. So I guess that's a call to more firm leadership to really think about, where all this is going, and to provide that space for their employees who care about this stuff to actually dig in and become the experts and make the suggestions or recommendations on the approach. I think it needs both, but I think I've been there.
Yeah.
And if you get frustrated because you just can't figure this tool or software out, or you have to go ask for $1,000 to get a license from your superior in a firm where you're trying to do billable work. I understand all of those limitations. I think they're there, but pilot. Get your feet wet, download the trials, take a little bit of time, even if it's, over a beer at home while the TV's on, and just start to get smart. And then use the tools that are there that are easily accessible, which is really what we're trying to do with EC3, is provide an easy interface as a kind of low-hanging fruit place to start. So please do go try EC3. It's free, and it's supposed to be something you can do in a few clicks.
Definitely. I feel as well that there's an obvious kind of ethical responsibility and an ethical reason why architects and architecture firms would explore this software more. To me, there's also a purely even just financial and commercial reason why they would, because I know that legislation moves slow, but certainly in the European context, we are moving towards requirements for understanding emissions in buildings and in embodied carbon and operational carbon, and actually those being enshrined in building standards. And we probably will reach a point eventually where if you're tasked with designing a building and you can't run and you can't provide these figures and these tools, it's going to hurt your business. It's going to hurt your bottom line. So there's advantages to I don't even say be early adopters, because we're all as a world we're late adopters, but there is a clear commercial advantage to staying on top of climate and emissions and understanding, and just having the capability in house to be able to measure and present these figures, because in 5 or 10 years and maybe sooner you might actually be required to.
Yeah, and I would tag on to the public policy side. I also call what large companies like the Microsofts and Amazons are doing as private policy, because there are these large global clients that don't just work here in the States, that work in global markets, that are starting to require this. They have zero carbon commitments by 2040 or 2045, including their supply chain. They have supplier commitments about disclosure and reporting and reduction. And as they start mandating the use of these tools, or at least the process of accounting for these emissions, because they are reporting them, as part of what they're turning in to CDP and part of what they're reporting out in their annual reports about reductions. That's also a big lever. And they can move much faster than public policy in a lot of cases, because they make the choice and then they say, please, all of my people that work for us, the architects, engineers, contractors, even other kinds of suppliers, there's bigger than just buildings for them when it comes to all of this, which is amazing from a supply chain perspective. They can just say, we are requiring this, you need to go figure it out, you must do this to work for us. That's a big market lever too, and a big kind of why behind some of this for all of us that do work for those large companies, kind of the global company that's requiring this.
To look ahead then over the next, say, 5 or 10 years, you folks have a really kind of interesting front row seat into how software and technology is evolving in the climate and in the design space, and technology is always exponentially increasing in capabilities and in experience. What kind of exciting, or I don't want to say exciting, important things maybe do you see coming down the line in terms of climate software, in terms of design software, climate technology? You mentioned a bit about improvements to Tally, which are coming up. So yeah, what kind of things do you think we'll see in the next 5 years, and what kind of capabilities do you think architects will have in the next 5 or 10 years which are maybe even more than today?
So there's a couple of things. I think the thing that I am most excited about right now is this shift from a whole bunch of competing solutions that each company or entity is developing for themselves to more of an ecosystem of solutions. So an example is that our database in EC3 of all this environmental product declaration data is available through an API that can be pulled into other tools. So we've got this one free user interface inside EC3, but there's also structural engineering firms and others that are pulling our data into tools that they're building for themselves to do some of this accounting based on how they have their BIM process set up or what tools they're using. So Bro-Happold has a way that they're pulling in the data from EC3's database into Rhino and using it for their own carbon accounting. So I think a move to more harmonized and standardized open data that anyone can pull digitally into tools that work for them is the direction we have to go with climate data, because really we want all the same starting point. We want the good, actual, real, open data that we know we can use to make these assessments. What is interesting is thinking about architects and engineers through the lens of software development. I know that Kieran Timberlake built the code and did all that work for Tally in-house. Bro-Happold's doing the same thing, where they're building this and then publishing it. And so the skill set of being able to understand software development and have folks that are architecture minded, but also can code is something really interesting. But that's really exciting if the data is not something that is kind of a dam where they can't access it. That data is there, then it allows everyone in all those different organizations and firms to really play with it and use it the best way that they can within their process.
To kind of wrap this all up then, and it's a question we're asking a lot of guests to kind of wrap things up. When you look ahead in climate related to the built environment, or the role of the built environment in combating climate change, and the role of architects and engineers in combating climate change, are you hopeful, or are you worried, or are you optimistic, or are you pessimistic about our ability to meet the increasingly demanding targets that we constantly seem to miss related to lowering emissions? Are you still hopeful, or are you more still concerned about the trajectory in architecture in the built environment?
I think I'm concerned about the trajectory in general, just based on where we are with the climate science and the time. I think temperatures have risen faster than they anticipated in the last IPCC report. Now it's updated, and the timeline's gotten shorter even, and the temperatures are rising faster. So my concern's more on that kind of overarching climate and where we are. When it comes to our role in it, I think, again, I've been in this space since I graduated in 2003, and it was always an uphill kind of churn and push when I started. Now there are job titles at all these architecture firms that have sustainability in them in a lot of cases, or there's at least someone that's got the onus to do this work. If we'll get there in time, I don't know, but if we don't try, shame on us. And the trajectory of adoption, kind of understanding of this, and the tools available on both the energy and kind of embodied carbon side, I feel like we're at a tipping point where we have what we need to do the work. Now it's just a matter of being smart enough to do it. So I don't know if that's a hopeful answer or not, but I think it will be our own fault if we don't make the progress we need to in the architecture, engineering, construction industry, because we're finally getting to the point where we have the tools and the data we need to do the work.
No, 100% agree. And I guess to end it all, it's because of the work that people like you were doing that we have those tools, because we arguably didn't have a lot of them 10 or 20 years ago, but we have them now. And increasingly, I feel like it is up to designers and even people watching this to actually go out and throw themselves into it. To kind of wrap up then, where can people find Building Transparency, and how can they follow the work that you guys are doing?
So our website's just www.buildingtransparency.org, and there's a register for free button right there to get easy access to EC3 right away. We also have a whole bunch of resources. There are YouTube videos on how to use the tool on the resources and videos tab. We've got an embodied carbon action plan, actually, that a group of 25 owners put together that walks through all these different steps that we've been talking about. We also have a LinkedIn page where we post updates and improvements in the tool and progress. So those are really the two best places. And then, of course, you can always just reach out to us through our contact us form. We're pretty responsive and excited to engage with anyone that wants to learn more.
Awesome. Well, thank you for engaging with us today, or this evening. we're really appreciative of it. So thanks again.
Thanks for the time.
That's all from us for now, so thank you for tuning into this episode of the Share Your Green Design podcast. Just a reminder before you go, you can subscribe to us over on Spotify, Apple, or anywhere you get your podcasts, or if you prefer watching the conversation, you can find us on YouTube. You can follow us over on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and WeChat at Share Your Green Design. That's all one word, Share Your Green Design. And remember, the podcast is only one small part of a much larger platform dedicated to sustainable architecture, engineering, and construction. To keep up to date with the latest projects, news, research, events, competitions, student work, and job adverts, head on over to shareyourgreendesign.com. Thank you everyone for your support, and we'll see you next time.